Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m., Wednesday, the 25th of September, and you are watching episode 146 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap providing insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, political parties. What is in a name? Is my guest Richard Davies, President of the Libertarian Party, Queensland.
Good
Richard is an
evening.
accomplished business professional with a career spanning over 5 decades. He is now retired, but has previously held senior leadership roles across various industries, including migration services, business consulting, transportation, professional sport administration, residential housing and training, showcasing his versatility and depth of expertise. Since retirement from professional life in 2022, Richard has volunteered to develop the Liberal Democratic Party, first working on the federal executive as assistant and then as secretary. Later, he was in the Reform Committee with a reform agenda adopted at the AGM in 2023, along with adoption of the name Libertarian Party. Richard was elected as the foundation president, Libertarian Party of Queensland, which constituted on the 23rd of July 2023, and applied with the registration Electoral Commission of Queensland on the 14th of June, with the registration granted as a political party in Queensland from the 2nd of August. So that was a quick step, Richard. Welcome.
Thank you, Bill. Good evening.
As it was there in the introduction, you were formerly the Liberal Democrats, and I have in the past interviewed Liberal Democrats. Tim Cooley from Victoria, when he was MLA for the Northern Province in Victoria. I was also interviewed John Ruddock last year before he headed off to Argentina. One of the few people to get him invited by Mr. Millet personally. So yeah, can you sort of give us a bit of an inkling in regards to how the Liberal Democrats were perceived and how they're operating, and is the change of name a little bit more than just a name change? Is there also other entities or factors in that sort of naming that sort of encase more what you want to achieve?
Yes, there is more to it than just a name change. The name change forced us to do something which we may not otherwise have done, but it's proving to be a good move to call ourselves Libertarian. But in addition, it became clear to some of us, and it was my strong opinion, that the party needed to restructure to be more effective. I sat on a reform committee for a year with representatives from other states, and we put up a proposal to the annual general meeting of the party to restructure to allow political parties to constitute separately in each state of Australia. If the members wanted to do that, it's optional, and then to affiliate back with the federal part of the party. And that's what happened. Queensland was the first to go through this process. New South Wales has followed, and Victoria is following. Queensland was quite intent to become a separate body because Queenslanders, we like doing things the Queensland way, and we were really wanting that little degree of independence that this new structure has provided. Just repeating what you said, that allowed us to get together the Queensland members of the old Liberal Democrats on the 23rd of July last year, and by a show of hands, we constituted a new body, a new membership body, which is a political party, which has now become registered, and we constituted that just over a year ago. Since that time, we have firstly, and it wasn't in the introduction, probably because I didn't highlight it, but we first registered with AEC as a branch of the federal party. So Queensland is now an independent branch recognised by AEC, and we're now a political party registered with ECQ, the Electoral Commission of Queensland. Now, that enables us to develop Queensland-only policies for state elections and local elections, and our affiliation agreement with the federal part of the party makes it a shared responsibility to run candidates for federal elections, which means we both have a say in who we endorse and what policies they run on. And this will be the first federal election that we've been working that system, and we are ironing the kinks out in it. It's a little bit confused this year because we're also running a Queensland election at the same time, so we are very busy.
Just as a matter of interest, do you think you would have got to this point if it wasn't for the changes back in started in 21 and then were instigated in 2022, where they changed the Electoral Act to increase the members requirement from 500 to 1,500 in the registration in the Commonwealth in the Australian Electoral Commission, and also the emphasis on ensuring that parties didn't incorporate any name from an existing party or a long-term name that could confuse the voters, because we all know voters are just can't think for themselves and they muddle everything up. So the government's got to take care of them and make sure they don't make a mistake when they putting the tick on the ballot. So do you think that accelerated the situation, or it would have naturally morphed into that anyway?
I would hope it would eventually have morphed into this, but I could be wrong. But we had no choice but to change the name. As you mentioned, they changed the Federal Electoral Act. Interesting point that Liberal Democrats gained the rights to use that name before the LNP gained the right to use the Liberal National Party name in Queensland. However, that wasn't the case in other states. We were still caught up in that Federal Act. We challenged it in the High Court. We had a narrow loss. It was 3 High Court justices to 2. We lost. We were able to contest the 2022 federal election under the name of Liberal Democrats. But immediately after that, we needed to change the name. The restructuring had its own impetus from elsewhere. A lot of that in Queensland came as a result of the 2022 election, where we ran a high-profile Senate candidate, and that was Campbell Newman. We raised a large amount of money, large for us, in the hundreds of thousands to contest that election, and it became an issue of management of that money between the Queensland part of the party and the federal. And as a result of that, the Queenslanders decided they really, really wanted to control their own destiny and their own bank accounts. And that led to the Reform Committee and led to the members approving the restructure to be what it is today. And today I'm representing Libertarian Party of Queensland, which is part of the Libertarian Party federally. And we have our own executive, we make our own decisions, and we run our own candidates in Queensland state and local government. And we share that responsibility with the party federally.
One of the things in regards to state versus federal sort of thing, it's always an issue, but it seems to me a fairly logical situation where the state people look after the state issues and that, and the federals got their own thing. Do you think this way the system will look better at the Constitution and recognise the areas that, are Commonwealth responsibilities versus state. Because I've just seen over my lifetime the excessive power, revenue power of the Commonwealth is basically blurring the lines between our original forefathers' belief what the federation should look like. I mean, education, for example. When I went to school, each state ran its own thing. We had a situation. I came from West Australia. Our system was fairly good, I thought. We were leaving school by 17. We only had 12 years of school. We had basically 7 primary grades and 5 high school grades. Then you always had the situation in eastern states between New South Wales and Victoria, where they'd argue who had the better education system. Now we've seemed to have an education system dictated to us, to the states, by the Commonwealth on the basis of their funding and telling them what's going to be in the curriculum. Do you see, besides just your philosophy and principles, do you see the opportunity there to sort of wrestle with some of those issues between the Commonwealth and the state power as far as they are constitutionally?
Short answer is yes, definitely. Let me go through that question and all its elements and unwrap it. We see great opportunity. The party has always had one of its principles being that of decentralisation and putting the decision-making at the sharp end of the business, as close to the front line as possible. We're a believer in competitive federalism. So it's a natural change for Libertarians to make. Going back to your reminiscing on school, I went through high school in Queensland, Southport State High School, shared that school with people like Clive Palmer, who's also an old boy from that school. I joined one of the services direct out of school, and you were dead right. We'd be in a common classroom with representatives from every state, and at that time, the Queenslanders and the West Australians were between 6 months and 12 months ahead in terms of particularly their maths, physics,
I didn't
sciences.
want to say that. I didn't want.
Well, I'll say it. That they were way ahead, and the Queenslanders and New South Wales, Queenslanders and the Sandgravers, the West Australians, we're used to leaving what is now year 12. We used to call it sixth form. We'd be 17 years of age, and quite a few from the other states.
And driving.
And
driving.
And driving, correct, incorrect, yes. And quite a few of the other states were 18, and as I said, 6, maybe even 12 months behind in some subjects in the curriculum. So that worked well. Queensland was one of the states that set the pace in education, and I don't remember particularly lots of people being left behind, because they had a very good system of streaming students according to their talents, their interests and their skills. And those that were pushed along an academic stream were the ones most suited to that, and those pushed along trade schemes or trade streams were similar for boys and for girls. And all of that went by the board as it started to federalise. We went into real lowest common denominator stuff. And, I've still got praise for some of the state schools in Queensland, because I've got grandchildren going to them, and some of the schools do a magnificent job. You could wish for better, but not all the schools. It's patchy. And overall, the results which are scored internationally show that the level of schooling is not a higher standard as it used to be. Now, I understand that subject matters will change. I mean, there's probably less emphasis on Shakespeare these days and more emphasis on robotics and coding and social media and internet and things like that. And there should be. My grandchildren show me how to use some of that stuff, and I'm very grateful to them. They're way better than I am. So the curriculum should shift, but I think we've lost a lot by trying to have a national curriculum. We've actually prevented the states that either put the resources or the effort or the smarts into improving the system. It's now a disincentive for them to do that. And I think no longer do we have pace setters and followers. We're all sort of lagging these days. So I agree with you.
Yeah. One of the things that changed dramatically was we had to become the smart country. So everyone was sort of pushed into an academic area. So I presume they had to dumb down the academic area if you've got to have to push everyone through it. So everyone goes to be completely stupid to be indoctrinated in the universities. But we did have a system that did look after the people who weren't academic, but, still had skills in that. I mean, we had our technical high schools. I remember going to high school, and then they're actually sampling people to go to other high schools that had a higher academic level. Like Belmont High was no special. Belmont High was a fairly good high school, but the thing is, they did find people who was academically inclined, and they'd get them to go to Kewdale High School, which had a higher level of thing. And the other thing is, those people who weren't tuned into the academic side, they had the opportunity to go and do tech school and things like that. They could go and become a chef or do all those pre-apprentice things. By year 10, they were starting that sort of thing. So if they had that talent, they aren't really left behind. Maybe they're not doing the academics things like, the system may want you to do, but they certainly get the grounding so they could become plumbers, cooks, chefs, and all other sorts of trades. So no one was really being left behind. They were just allowed to find the niche in life that suited them best.
I think that's a very good way of saying it, Bill. And I'll throw in an additional thought. Not only were they being allowed to find their own path in life, it also took account that not all kids develop through education at the same pace. And I'll give you two examples from my cohort at school. There was one boy who did the trade. He did the metalworking, the woodworking, and the drawing. And he developed late and later became an engineer, and was one of the first people in Australia to contract slots for launching satellites. And he invented a way of graziers being able to monitor their cattle on the vast cattle stations in Australia remotely from satellite, where he could track not only where each particular beast was, but could monitor things like their body temperature and their dehydration levels. Now, he invented that, and he went through the trade stream. And one of the girls who went through the domestic science, which might have been overstating cooking skills and shorthand and bookkeeping in those days, in catching up with her at school reunions years later, she went on to work for the United Nations in Geneva for decades. So there are some people at school who are struggling to find their way, who are not academic, and who actually find, their best talents later in life afterwards, because they had the chance to continue and develop the skills they had to get the confidence of being good at something, not being pushed, like a round peg into a square hole. Everybody has to do academia.
The other thing is too, what happens is those people, they get disengaged from the system. And,
Yes.
and that leads to them, feeling, well, I can't do this, I can't contribute, so I'm going to just wander out of the system, or I'm not going to really take notice of what's going on in class and just, waste a few years of my life. So that's also a job of the education system, is to keep people engaged. And if you're putting them into a pathway that that doesn't suit them, you're driving them out of the system.
Absolutely, that's dead right. A disengaged teenager is a disruptor and a troublemaker more often than not. And we see that today with the levels of youth crime, and we watch it on TV every night. Young offenders breaking in, stealing cars, terrorizing people. And, they're all originally good kids, but it starts with disengaging. Now, if you can head that off and engage them in something and make them good at something, make them feel valued at something, make them feel confident that there is a place for them and they can, society needs them and they can do something well, whether that be trade or academic or any other choice. If you can do that, I think the disengagement level is lower and the final outcomes are better.
I suppose that has to be one aim of the Libertarian Party, is to sort of unravel all that centralisation over time, because you believe in smaller governments and decentralisation. And let's face it, I mean, Canberra doesn't, the federal government doesn't actually run a school, but it's got about 4,000 public servants that dictate what you do. So that's a bit of a problem. But moving on to other sort of philosophies and that, how about things like your structure for the Libertarian parties? We've got other parties in the system, long-established parties like the Liberals and Labor, and they've had their branches and things like that. You've got fairly newer parties. You've got One Nation, it's been around still 30 odd years, but still doesn't believe in a branch system or having input from its members. Where does the Libertarians stand on input from the membership, and how the overall local and sort of state branch operates?
Okay, let's go through them. We're not a personality-based party. Pauline Hanson's been around for 30 years, bless her. And good luck to Pauline Hanson, One Nation, when she does retire, because I'm not sure what we're going to call it then.
I think it's already changed to just one party.
One Nation?
I think they've dropped it. I think they've dropped it just to One Nation. They've actually
Okay.
changed the name to write out the Pauline Hanson lead-in bit, so it's just One Nation now.
Well, we're not a personality-based party. We don't follow a single person. We follow principles. We believe in individuals. We're not against free association. It's not a blanket no against any form of collectivism, because we, as individuals, choose to join a particular party and work together. But that's free association. But we do have an emphasis on individuals, and that goes back to our previous conversation as well as to the structure of the party. We've got a strong belief in our branches running semi-autonomously. When we started the party in July last year, we had 5 branches, and we said to the branch conveners, we really don't have the resources to tell you what to do and to micromanage you. Can you please just sort of do something productive? And they said, what? Well, we said, well, just, I suppose, anything that your members want you to do. So each of the branches has developed truly their own personality. They're all effective. Gold Coast is probably our fastest growing, most dynamic branch. And Sunshine Coast has got a different style. The Brisbane branch has gone their own way, and then we've got Ipswich, and we formed another couple of little branches and a virtual branch. They've all got their own convener. Often they call themselves a branch president, and they're free to seek counsel from the members of their branch to run events. They could be social events, they could be political events, they could be any events the members want to run to satisfy them and their needs. We all share a common set of principles, so as long as it's aligned with those principles, they choose their own course, and that's our philosophy, and that's how we operate. Policy formulation, we've actually got a model for that. Our policy formation, and we haven't done a lot of this in Queensland yet because we're a pretty brand new entity. But firstly, it can come from an individual or a branch or a committee, might even be a policy committee, but they don't have the monopoly. If one of the branches feels strongly that we need a policy on something, they can put up, we have process, they can put up a motion from that branch, and the executive will consider that, and we'll go through the rest of our consultation and socialisation process for that policy. We check that it's consistent with our principles, and the principles are in the Constitution and very difficult to change. They're embedded. So we check that it aligns with our principles. We've got a sort of a branding and messaging guide. We check that the tone and messaging of the policy complies with that. And then we put it to a vote. If it's during an election campaign, we'll further tune it to align it with the issues of that campaign. If you look at the candidates we've got running for the state election, you'll find that they've chosen their own platforms locally. They all align with the principles of the party, but our Gold Coast candidate has a position on the light rail. Our Brisbane candidate has a position on Olympic stadiums, and so forth. So we do give a lot of freedom to individual members and to branches and candidates to promote, as long as they're libertarian aligned to principles, to promote their own policies their own way. We don't believe in an authoritarian top-down, you must do this, you must do that, and learn the script and don't deviate by a single word. We don't believe in that. We probably won't run a candidate in this Queensland election from North Queensland, but North Queenslanders have their own style of thinking and their own issues, and it's going to be quite different to somebody down in the southeast. So we've got the flexibility within the party to do that. And you've previously interviewed Tim Quilty, so you know he's got different ideas to somebody in Melbourne.
Well, actually, I'll just do a screen share of your principal sort of thing. So who sort of, I mean, you give the groups freedom, but to do a little bit themselves and go their way on their individual area type things or electorates. But it's really important to have a unified front on a lot of policies and that. So how do you sort of make sure or may just prod people, look, yeah, we understand your policy, but it's not quite aligning with our principles. So go back and sort of realign it. So you've got individual liberty, free markets, and small government. Well, we have a major party that basically wants to centralise government and that, and then we've got a promise that says it believes in small government and never delivers anything about it, even though it's been in power in the federal sphere, for about 40 years, 30 years out of the last 40 or so. So it amounts to naught. In regards to government and the principles, these values therefore will seek to reduce the intrusion in the lives at the lowest level possible, consistent with the preservation of civil society. So somewhere in that, you can have vested interest in people who want to go hunting, shooting, and fishing sort of thing, versus people who always craves to be kept safe, and aims to restore individual right to make for people to make their own choices and accept responsibility for their consequences on the basis of making better decisions than the government. Sometimes I'm not sure if there's a lot of people capable of doing that, because there seems to be a lot of people who have become more dependent on government and always seeking first thing they want, what's the government going to do? How the government going to fix it instead of fixing themselves? So, do you think there's some sort of need for getting people to first become more resilient in themselves, so they don't have this first reaction tendency for a problem is get the government to fix it?
Yeah, and we have particular political parties that try to win votes by giving away free stuff. and, and like 50-cent public transport fees and electricity subsidy. They don't get down to the price of electricity. They put subsidies so that you pay less of a bigger bill. There are people like that, and social cohesion is, I think, more of an issue today in Australia than it was when I was growing up. You read out some very important words in our principles that it talks about the preservation of civil society. And I want to get that across, because even some of our own members forget that at times, that we love individual freedoms, maybe to fish, to hunt, to four-wheel drive, even to shoot. We love individual freedoms, but we forget that we've also got to live together in a civil society. And that's what distinguishes libertarians from anarchists, who don't want to follow any rules. We recognise that there has to be some norms, and sometimes it can be done by culture and tradition. Other times you do have to actually have a law or regulation. We all have to drive on the left-hand side of the road. Is that any better than the right-hand side? Probably not. But we've all got to do one thing, or else there'll be chaos. So some rules might be arbitrary, but nonetheless, to be a cohesive and civilised society, we do have to recognise some restraints. And it's a well-known principle of libertarianism is the not harming others. And it's always a balance. And if you've got two libertarians in a room, they'll always argue about where that balance is. And with two people in the room, there'll be at least 3 or 4 opinions argued. So it's a hot issue. But in general terms, we like as little regulation as possible, while preserving that civil society. I think your question had some other elements, but can you remind me?
No, well, it's just how do you sort of, with that scope, ensure that you can get people on the same page when you need them, especially when you're presenting at an election. It's all well for people to have differing views, but you never want to confuse the voter. That they're not sure what they're getting. So how do you make sure that when it comes to, especially in important policies and that everyone's on the same page? There has to be some sort of directive or overriding guideline or principle. Like you've got your principles, but there's a lot of flexibility there for individuals. But when it comes to the crunch at election time, if people from the same party are putting up different things, you'll have a media that will try to show that in the worst light possible, that how can you possibly govern when you can't even keep your people together and be on the same page? So how do you sort of think you can herd all the cats in?
Okay, herding cats is a management style, and it's not easy, let me tell you. At the end of the day,
We've got
the Queensland Party.
There,
I'll keep going because you can still hear me.
Yep, go
Yeah,
ahead.
at the end of the day, the Libertarian Party of Queensland and also the Federal Party each elect an executive, and they both happen to be 9 members. And at the end of the day, those 9 members can vote and make a determination, and they have the capability to be authoritarian and directive if they have to be. But I can tell you from a practical point of view, directing libertarians or directing cats doesn't work particularly well. You're better off entering into what sometimes seems like endless dialogues, discussion, at the end of the day, appealing to the better nature of the majority to compromise a little bit and to go along with us on particular things at particular times. Um, so that's how we do it. It is challenging. It's more trouble than simply, sitting around the table in a smoke-filled room and making up directives and diktats. It's much harder than that because but there's absolutely no point in directing members if they refuse to follow you. All our party are volunteers, and if we ask them to do something they're unhappy with, they don't have to do it. They can passively resist by just staying home. Uh, it comes around at times like we're coming up the time in the Queensland election where we're going to have to do how to vote cards and negotiate preferences. Now, it tends to be delegated to one person or a couple of people because you have to talk to every other party and you're not going to give them another party a benefit unless you get something back. So it's a multilateral negotiation, and that's complex enough. And there'll be some electorates where you're trying to get the candidate elected, and the other candidate that's probably ahead of you has got similar principles or similar policies, and the arithmetic of the ballot box dictates that you will want to give your preferences to to the candidates you think you can beat, the third and fourth and the fifth, and get the exchange rather than the party similar to yours. So sometimes you've got to make really tough decisions, and you have to explain this to your members, and some of them go along with it grudgingly, and some of them sulk, and some of them argue. But once they've been through a couple of election campaigns and they get a feel for what you're doing and how you're doing it and why you're doing it, or get put into a position of responsibility within the party themselves and realise that they have to do that, you get much more tolerance. It's a question of trust. You can't operate a party such as ours unless there's a high trust level, and that's got to be a high trust level amongst members, amongst candidates, and that tends to rub off on voters. And having that high trust level does assist us, but we can't manage any other way with volunteers and volunteer officials. That's
Well,
not a complete solution, but it does work fairly well.
the state election is just over a month away, a month and 1 day. It's on the 26th of October. So obviously you're not going to be overly prepared for that. But working towards the federal election, you probably got 6 months grace. I don't think Albanese would be too happy about going too early because he's not doing so well. He'll probably need another honeypot budget to sort of help him get through to the next election. But it could happen as early as March or whatever. But by then, the workings in regards to the federal and the state. Do you think the federal body will sort of be selecting the main issues to look at and coming up with the policies, and then sort of getting the fix from the various states and their acceptance of those? Because we've got a system now. I mean, the federal government's supposed to be looking after certain things, but they're sort of messing up and getting involved in, like at least the local candidates are getting in mixed up in things like sports sheds for the local area and things like that. That's not defence. That's not border protection. That's not biosecurity policy. That's not the key things that the federal government are doing. Are supposed to be looking after. Do you think the federal discussion and elections, people are voting on local things rather than what the federal government really is supposed to be delivering for the nation? And how do you think you'll fit in with that mold? Will you be forced to go along with that in regards to offering the local constituents gifting and that, and sort of not concentrating on the key role of the federal government, what it's supposed to deliver?
You're absolutely right, and it's a very perceptive observation. We share the responsibility with the federal part of the party, and we are in discussion, and we've got a temporary point of view that I think will prevail. But the federal part of the party will select 3 policy areas. Each of the state will select 3. Now, in addition, we're asking for the candidates to be able to select 3 local policies, and a platform of 6 to 9 is probably as many issues as just about any candidate will really want to use, probably more than they need. You're absolutely right. The reality of getting elected, unfortunately, does distract candidates from the big national issues. But it's the reality. There's a fair number of voters who are not completely clear about distinctions between state and federal, or even local, state and federal. So it does get blurred.
A lot of politicians don't even know the difference. I would also suggest a lot of politicians have never read the Constitution.
You could be right. I don't know. You could be right.
I tell you.
Or the Constitution of Queensland, for that matter. Queensland has its own constitution. Yeah, that's all true, and we can't divorce ourselves from voter reality entirely. And some things, you mentioned health and education before, the vast number of federal public servants in health, for example, who don't run hospitals, and in education who don't have any schools. But it goes further than that. One of the issues current is that of private property and property rights. And at first blush, you're tempted to say that's a state issue because all the title deeds and the system of land administration is state. But then it gets overlaid with something like the federal native title law. And then the states go and pass another law I think it's called the Native Title Act in Queensland, that derives off the federal Native Title Act and allows the Queensland government to allocate Crown land to individuals, which they're currently doing, allocating it to private companies. And it all gets done cloaked or masked with a confusion, a lack of transparency, and very little accountability. But when you drill into it, is that a state issue or is it a federal issue? Or does your federal politician, really need to have a handle on all of that? And that, I think, is closer to the answer. We're already facing that we've got a couple of Senate candidates racing around Queensland doing a lot of public meetings, Lachlan Lade and Jim Wilmot. And that's one of the issues they're encountering. It's not just confusion of the voters as to what's federal and state law, but the legislation has been intertwined in such a way that it's darn hard to untangle, and you've really got to be across both lots. And that does confuse the issue between state and federal. It also makes administering candidates more challenging. But I think we're getting on top of that.
I still think part of it's the problem in regards to how the separation of powers have been clouded over the years. And
Mm,
it's not just the coercion of the federal government and its revenue raising, because the federal government raises somewhere between 90 and 95% of all revenue, and then deals it out basically to coerce the states into doing what they want, sort of thing, whether it's education
mm.
policy or whatever. Um,
But the
so
states have been willing participants in that. That they willingly handed across income taxing powers. Now, there was
I don't
a
agree
reason in
with
the
that.
first place.
I think they was mistaken. That will happen during World War II,
It did.
and it was sort of reasonable in the way of the peril at the time.
At the
It
time.
was a logical argument. However,
They haven't tried
the
too hard to get it back, though.
That's the thing. But the thing is, you've got to understand what happened is we were still on rations in the
Mm.
early part of the 1950s. So
Yes.
the mentality of the rations and the problems of World War II hadn't quite left us, and we went straight into the Korean War. So
Mm.
the states didn't go. It was New South Wales went back to the High Court sometime later and asked for them back, and the High Court said no, found in favour of the Commonwealth. So yeah, big mistake by the states not getting back, asking for it back early. But now it's gone from uh, the system where you've got this now so-called independent grants commission that works out how much we're going to hand out each state. But it's sometimes not overly favourable to states that are looking after their own economy.
Exactly.
And so, West Australia is a point in case. It got down to a situation where it was only getting about 33 cents in the dollar of its GST back.
Correct.
Because it was getting royalties from iron ore. But the thing is, what it was also dealing was a huge influx of people from the eastern states going over to the workforce in mining and stuff. So they had to provide more schools, they had to provide more
Mm.
services, and the fact that they weren't getting that portion of money necessary to deal with that influx of people hurt it badly, and it actually revived the old West Australian separate secession movement a bit there for a while.
Well, West Australia only voted to join the Commonwealth because of the number of eastern staters over there that did the voting, I'm told, in one history book I read. But you're
Well,
absolutely
well,
right. I mean, we really badly want to get rid of payroll tax because it's a bad tax. But the the powers that dole out the GST still consider Queensland's got the potential to charge a payroll tax. So even if they choose not to collect it, they won't adjust the GST distribution. So there are large kinks in the way it's done. And ideally that they shouldn't be there. But you've got to work with what is. You mightn't like it, but you've got to work with what is and get yourself elected so that you can vote to change it or improve it.
yeah, but it certainly doesn't help pointing out to people that this is really a federal issue or this is a state issue when you're sort of running, and you've still got to harvest the votes in the first place. Um, Other areas of government sort of intervention and stuff, and some things we need as a country because we're sparsely populated in a lot of areas, and we don't have the scale of economy for our land mass in a lot of areas. So there has to be some sort of government sort of help or favourable conditions. I don't think it's like a lot of people are banging on now that there should be special economic zones and that for Northern Australia. Northern Australia and especially Northern Queensland don't need special economic treatment. What they need is the ability to develop their own land and country, to get dams built, to get roads built, not to be hampered by legislation that says, oh, you can't your land's got to get locked up for carbon credits because we're beholden to the United Nations, or we've got to destroy your fishing industry because someone's telling us we haven't got the stock for fish. So it's really not. We don't need a special economic zone. We need to look after our own destiny more than likely, more realistically, and we need more political influence for our own area. So that's one of your sort of charters is, basically small government. Can you give us a bit of an outline of sort of principles that would sort of fall into that?
Well, you're absolutely right. Small government with authority devolved as close as possible to the scene of action. And North Queensland is up to 2,000 kilometres away from Brisbane, and they should be making their own decisions, and be more in charge of their own destiny. We greatly believe that. It can be done in different ways. It's a very libertarian way of thinking. But it applies to schools where a school is autonomous and self-governing to a degree, where the principal's got latitude of action, and where the Parents and Citizens Committee and the teachers can make adaptations to the local suburbs, the local community, the local area, the school thrives. It's sort of centralising control and just introduces the lowest common denominator factor. Similar with hospitals. We've got all sorts of trouble with birthing centres, maternity centres in hospitals all around Queensland, and they're tending to centralise them in the larger hospitals where they can control the risks, and then just sort of brush off the fact that expectant mothers are going to have to travel hundreds of kilometres, which is ridiculous. I mean, surely there's a bigger risk in that than having local birthing centres. So it pervades the whole range of government services to try to devolve responsibility closer to the where the rubber hits the ground, where the locals want to say. And again, our experience in the party is there might be 2 or 3 different ways of doing things, which are all pretty close together, all okay. But I'll tell you which one will get implemented most enthusiastically is if you let the locals make their own decision which way they want to go. They will rally around and they will ensure that is successful. They might push aside 2 or 3 other choices that are equally as good that could have been imposed on them. But, they won't be overly enthusiastic on somebody from far away telling them what to do or how to do it. But if they decide for themselves, they will make it work. And that's human nature.
When you've got skin in the game, it's a whole different kettle of fish.
Yes.
If you feel like, well, what's the point of saying anything or doing anything because it's just dictated to us? We can't complain about curriculum because it's just centrally controlled by the Commonwealth sort of thing. So there's a feeling of helplessness, so there's no participation. And I think this is probably one of the reasons there's been a big disconnect between parents and teachers. Now, when we were kids, if you played up at school and it got back to your parents, you got it, basically, because there was this innate partnership between teachers and parents and the general community. That is sort of dissipated over time, and now parents and teachers sometimes are now adversaries. So that's not a good situation. And like I say, if things were more local, the cohesion would be a lot better, and probably the retention of teachers would be a lot better as well.
Well, some parts of the world, the teacher during the school vacation actually goes around each of the homes and visits the parents and sits down with them, has a meal, and the child witnesses the parents and the teacher getting together and colluding in their future.
They've got to, they're out to get me. They're out to get me.
Well, I'm not sure if it's that, but they're working with goodwill towards the same aim. And I'm not saying that ever used to happen in Australia, but as you say, teachers and parents were closer together once upon a time. Um, yes, uh, and I know what I wanted to say when I was listening to you before. Our lead Senate candidate, Jim Wilmot, is currently touring around the state and he's reporting back from every corner of the state, from North Queensland through to inner Brisbane to Toowoomba, Gold Coast, everywhere. People are feeling powerless. They're feeling they don't have a voice. They're feeling they're not being listened to. It's, Jim's a rural guy. He's a beef farmer, and he said he was surprised to encounter the same thing in the cities as he is in the regions. But it's exactly what you say, because everything's being centralised so much and being controlled with IT systems and so forth. People do feel powerless. They don't feel empowered. They don't even want to raise their voice because they don't feel anyone's listening to them. They don't feel they can change things even if they try hard. So you're absolutely right in reporting that. We're finding the same thing.
I've been interviewed Jim before as a chairman of Property Rights Australia, and I mean they're basically there for rural and regional people in regards to the intrusion of government into their day-to-day business, just about. And I mean, the government never seems to stop. It takes ground, and then it goes the next inch, and again, to where now that they've got things like they've got to fly drones over people's property, and if there's a little bit of wear and tear by the cattle, because they trot down on one track or something continuously. Actually, sheep are worse. They're dumb as all hell. Now they'll wear a great big groove in the ground because they all follow each other. But they're spied on. They're going to be spied on, and if there's some sort of bit of deterioration, they can be fined lots of money, and it gives
Exactly.
and the government has the right to come on their property. This is getting so intrusive. It's beyond belief.
You're absolutely right. And Jim Wilmot's been surprised to find the same thing applies in the cities. It definitely applies out in the regions, but in the cities, fire ants are all around Brisbane now, and there's aerial spraying of who knows what chemicals going on, and people are concerned with that. There's properties being resumed that were only new houseland packages 1 or 2 years ago, and through poor planning, they're now wanting to put freeway exits, and they're resuming houses. And the government's a tough bargain. They don't want to pay market value. They're out for getting it at a bargain price, which means that people are being really hard done by just because a freeway exit wasn't planned and set aside at the beginning. Now, that doesn't diminish what's going on in the regions. There's plenty of problems in the regions, but there's more similarities there than you might expect. There's more similarities than what Jim expected to find.
Well, being the region, I don't care about the southeast Queensland at the moment anyway. But just touching on that, we also got stupidity. I mean, if you go back 20, 30 years, I come from Perth, and the people down, there, 30, 40 years ago had plans for roads and things like that, and they reserve lands. I think the Roe High was a classic example. It was a forethought of running from the Perth airport to get around and down to Fremantle without going across the city, sort of thing. And a lot of that been reserved for years and years. But then a government got in and thought, gee, all this land's sitting there, let's flog it off. And basically now that arterial type system, you run past, get to where you're in level with Perth, and that road dissipates then, and you have to find your way through on the all road because they've got rid of the thing. Then even in Cairns, we actually, 30 or 40 years ago, they planned a ring road around Cairns, and that land was allocated. But then someone decided at the state, well, Cairns is not going to grow; it won't need this, so let's flog it off. And then the access, which would have provided the ring road, basically from the southern to the northern section, without going, within a couple of kilometres of the city, could have been done. But people in the wisdom have come along later and said, oh no, let's get rid of that. So there's full of dumb mistakes all over the place.
And it's not letting the locals have enough say, because I'll bet you, even though I don't specifically know the region, that the locals around there would have known the long-term consequences. And if they'd been involved in the decision making, they'd have put their hands up and said, no, don't sell this off. We're going to need this in 20 years' time. But somebody sitting in William Street in Brisbane won't know that, and probably care even less, particularly if they're on a 3-year or 4-year term, and they plan to retire in 4 years. They're not going to give tuppence. There's no incentive for them. But this comes back to including people at the local level in decisions that are going to impact on them and listening to them.
One of the other things, because I noticed that when I was talking to Jim Courty, and admittedly in those days it was still the Liberal Democrats. And one of the sort of philosophies he was talking about was the monetarisation of things, such that you encourage private enterprise to take up building it or whatever. I sort of didn't quite, sort of agree with some of that, because I think there's some things that's private enterprise is probably not good at doing it, or if it is in the hands of private enterprise, what happens? It becomes, oh yeah, this is making money, and so people get competitive and start buying out other stakeholders, and then you either get a monopoly or duopoly or something like that. And once that happens, well, then the prices are sort of for utilities of that can get a bit out of hand and not be in the benefit of the people. So, do you have a sort of view on things like water and electricity in regards to there has to be some sort of settings as far as the government goes for those sort of things?
We have those sorts of discussions because we've got members. We favour private property ownership, and we've got some members who are totally that way, and others, and I count myself amongst the others, believe that there should be some government monopolies, particularly on utilities. It's not necessarily that the government's going to be more efficient, but efficiency isn't everything. Having the stability of ownership, the certainty of who owns it, and that there's a benign owner that the people can influence via the ballot box is quite reassuring when it comes to water supply, electricity supply, and perhaps other things too. If anything, I think where we tend to settle is, where possible, have public ownership with private competitors, such as state-owned schools and private schools, state-owned hospitals and private hospitals, and have them compete, because competition is one of the great drivers of new technology and adaptation. And in changing technology in a changing world, being able to be fairly agile and to keep up a pace of change is important. And monopolies are not good at that. Monopolies get too comfortable. So even a state-owned monopoly. So we always like a bit of a private competitor. They may not be as large as the government, but they set the pace. And people look up and say, wow, they're only a tenth the size of the government enterprise, but look how good they are. And it agitates a little bit. Competition stirs up a competitive urge, and that provides the incentive to try to make things continually better. That continual improvement is what moves our society along and creates prosperity. And it's a competitive world. If we don't keep evolving and improving, well, they're not going to stop somewhere else, and we'll lose our preeminence in a lot of ways, and unless we sort of make some effort to stay up with them.
A lot of parties go to the election, especially in the federal or sometimes in the state. They we're going to have open and transparency and all this sort of thing. And what it usually turns out, everything's basically locked up. I mean, COVID was a classic example. We will never know what information they're actually running on. Transparency and spending doesn't seem to be great. So, in regards to, if you ever hold a position to, bounce the power or in the Senate or things like that, do you think this thing of holding governments to account and transparency is ever going to happen, or do you think we're always going to have this behind closed doors and these confidentialities agreement? Because I mean, things for like renewables, will be great to know what all these confidential agreements, feed-in tariffs, and that are, and how much they're costing us. So, do you think there's a role for further along the road for parties like your own to extract or ensure that transparency and accountability of government?
I'd love to have a policy to guarantee it. But there's always a tension. One thing I know is the larger the government, the more the number of state secrets, and the less access the public seems to have. One of the things that always jars with me is we use the term public servant, that they are there to serve the public, but it seems that's been forgotten. And the public are the voters, the ultimate authority in a democracy. They need information to make rational decisions. Not everyone will be rational, but amongst the total population of voters, there's enough rational people to generally make fairly intelligent decisions if they have the information. So definitely, we've got to ensure that the information is available.
I think one of the big problems with this public servants is it's always empire building.
Yep.
Every bit of legislation comes through, and the government's at fault. Basically, it brings in more legislation that automatically puts more public servants in the system. There's never effort to wind back legislation or throw out some of the bad stuff, but every bit of new legislation usually adds more public servants to sort of make sure it's implemented and then put their own stamp on it. So that's a big problem we've got. We've got now a public service that is so big. It has in its own right an influence on elections. It's self-interest to ensure that it's not attacked or reduced is out there all the time, and they're doing everything they can to at least maintain their level, if not increase that empire.
I think you're right, and it's a natural behaviour for people in large organisations to be a bit that way, which is why we say that smaller government generally is better, and that's not an attack on government services. We do need services, but smaller governments, we feel, are better. It's one of our principles. And personally, I'm a great believer in the 1 in, 2 out rule. For every page of legislation, for every regulation, if you want to put it up and put it in, give me 2 more and we'll take them out. And gradually simplify things. Things are now so complex that you'll get different advice from each different department in the government. Nobody brings it all together and says the best thing for the state or the nation is a particular course of action. You get government departments warring with each other on their own perspectives. National parks these days are not being run for the interests of the owners, the public. They own those national parks, state forests, and so forth. They're being run for the benefit of the people in the department a lot of the time.
And lock out the people who should be using them.
Exactly.
Just touching on one last thing before we go, and hopefully we'll have some of your people back in the future to have discussions. But one of the things that got me interested in regards to admittedly it was 11 Liberal Democrats and with Tim Courty talking about monetarisation. monetarisation of water. I think even without the monetarisation of water, we've got huge problems with when the licenses for water were separated from the land. And I understand the idea of transfer water usage, and that was a good idea because had friends in Seymour on the Goulburn River, and there wasn't too many times that they were ever short of water that was running down from the snowies and things like that. So they were sort of well off, and it was a benefit later on when there was ability to trade some of that water with someone who needed the water, up on the Murray-Darling Basin, sort of things like that. And it was a beneficial for both because the people who had the surplus water made a bit of money, and the people who needed the water got the water, and it was at a reasonable rate. But then it was completely separated, and people started selling the license. So now we've got a system, especially on the Murray-Darling, where the allocation and the licensing allotment is completely separated. And we have people who have got nothing to do with owning land or that, owning the water allocation, and the owner might be some family trust or that comes out of Bermuda or something like that, registered there. But the thing is, we don't even know who's the registered owners. There is no public register of water. And I think that's a big problem. And the way it is now in the monetarisation of water, it's in the best interest of those people holding water allocation and licenses for there to be less water in the system because it makes their license more valuable. I think that's one of the faults in regards to if you're thinking about monetarisation of things like utilities and that, this is where it can go wrong, that the people benefiting most, and if we don't know who they are, they're obviously influencing politicians or trying to influence politicians to make sure there's no extra water in the system. So we've got a situation, and our big problem is in Australia. It's supposedly water's a big problem, but we don't have a problem with water. We have good rainfall. What we have is a logistics and vision problem. There's plenty of water up the north, but no one's letting us build a dam, so we can either use it ourselves or send it down south or whatever, whichever way. So sometimes I just wonder whether there's powers that be that basically stop us in northern Queensland getting a dam in that, because it would be detrimental for if there was more water in the system to people who own the allocation already.
I recognise the problem, and as soon as you come up with any system, being it a monetised system or anything else, people are going to game it, and that's part of the problem. And you're right. If scarcity does raise prices and profiteering, so off the top of my head, I can't suggest what the right solution would be, but it sometimes is resulting, as you say, from the federal government decision to sign a treaty with a world body such as the United Nations, and then the people in North Queensland not even hearing about it, and all of a sudden there's satellites going over, and there's public servants coming around enforcing something that the locals had absolutely no knowledge of. I mean, one of the scary things is that the public servants quite often, they're there for a lifetime career, and they're not thinking just for the 4 years that they're elected. They're there for a lifetime, and some of them are doing planning. And in Queensland, the Queensland government actually has the right to own all rainfall, and that applies in the city too. Sometimes I come across a neighbour and they've got a water tank, and I say, Queensland government actually owns the water in that water tank. That's the same with farms. A farmer might have built a dam. A satellite goes over and measures what water's in the dam, and there is the potential there for the government to come and say, that water's ours, please give us our water, or you can or can't do something with it. It's wrong. It's too intrusive. The problem's there.
I have had people on from talking about Murray-Darling, and that's probably a big point in case. It's
It is.
the
It's not in
environmental flow,
Queensland, but
but just locally for them, the environmental flow requirements because of the environment, which is level from the federal government, but it's basically level because like you say, we've signed onto some treaty somewhere, and then legislation's been developed, but then it becomes insidious. Like some of the intent was never there, but when the public service gets it and molds the legislation to go around it, does become more intrusive than what it was ever intended to. And so you've got the situation now in like on the Murray-Darling, you've got them taking 3,350 thousand gigaliters out of the system off the irrigator. So that provides hardship. It also jeopardizes our food security. But one of the things in the UN thing, it was all their rules basically says you're not supposed to jeopardize food security. But when our government's got it, introduced it and legislated, that's exactly what they can do. So it seems you can't lay all the blame on the UN and its treaty. It seems that we have zealots in the system who just want to work it to the nth degree.
exactly.
Anyway, well, look, we've run over time, but it's been very pleasurable to have you on. I also, as we move towards the federal election, I hope to contact Jim Wilmot again and have a bit of a discussion with him. But can you give us a bit of an outline before you go, what your hopes and visions are for the Libertarian Party in Queensland, and how hopeful you are of people accepting the name change and embracing libertarianism?
People come and ask us, who are the Libertarians and what do we stand for? But the great opportunity is it's not a negative question. And when we start talking about it, they go, aha, yeah. But particularly Australians have always been a little bit anti-authoritarian. We've always liked to do our own things, being individuals, foster our own resilience. And we talk about these sorts of principles, and most Australians identify with them. There's a lot of people who are libertarians but don't yet realise it. And when they look at our principles and look at our policies, they actually identify with them. So we think our future is great. We think there's a place in politics for us. There's another party that's represented by a colour, which is a bit of a lie because they're not really environmentalists at all. That's come from almost nothing a couple of decades ago, and it is now a balance of power party. And we think we can do that as well. On the spectrum, the other party I referred to likes to control things through a centralised government, and we're at the other end of the spectrum, where we think individuals should be making their own decisions in their own best interests, not trying to tell somebody else what to do and how to live their life. And we think there's a real place for us in Australian politics and in Queensland politics. We've only been registered in Queensland about 6 or 7 weeks, but already we have strong hopes, and we are striving to get somebody elected to the Queensland Parliament. We don't want to get a small percentage of primary votes. We do. We're grateful for every vote, but we really want to get somebody elected. There's no upper house. We have to go straight to the lower house, where we need two-party preferred 50% plus one vote. And that's the field of competition we're in, and we're trying to condition ourselves for that sort of contest immediately. Federally, the Senate is still elected on a group voting basis, and Jim Wilmot, our lead Senate candidate, and Lachlan Lade, they need each one quota to get elected, and that's approximately 1/7, or about 14% after preference distribution. It's possible, even likely, they'll get it. Jim will get in with a primary vote of 7 or 8%, because other politicians before them have done that. So they actually stand a fairly good chance of getting one of them elected at least. So we'd love to get a senator elected from Queensland every 3-year election cycle. And we are aiming to be an influential party in politics. At different times in the course of the election cycle, we might even hold the balance of power. We might act as a counterweight to those who are much more authoritarian, centrist, and want large government to control and micromanage citizens. We can act as a counterweight to that, and I think people will be very pleased to see us in the political contest. Even the traditional parties that form office, I think, will be pleased for the role we can play in future. And I think we will play a big part in making Australia a better place and Queensland a better place.
Okay then, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your time. If you can just stay on the line, I'll just introduce next week's show.
Thanks. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Richard, for your time. Really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the night show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, please join me. I'm not sure it's going to be Wednesday or Tuesday night, but I'll be having Dr. Peter Ridd on, and we'll be talking about the last assessments by the Reef Authority people. In the reef is in great danger, and it's happening now. So please join me again next week. Thank you.